Alright folks, welcome back to Mauna Kea. We're up here by the visitor center photographing this low tree. We've got all our cameras set up nice and low to the ground to get that angle kind of pointing up towards the tree. And just doing a quick time lapse, Sony a1ii Mark II, 14mm G Master, standard stuff. But today I wanted to kind of test out, do a little bit of another gear test here. Sony a1ii Mark II against the original Sony a1ii. Now, on paper, they look very similar. They share the same 50 megapixel sensor, but I was wondering if internally, if there was some sort of processing or internal algorithm that changed the way noise is processed with the generation upgrade. Additionally, when the a1ii Mark II was released, I guess they mentioned in the press briefing and stuff that it was supposed to have better noise reduction, but lo and behold, we found out that was only like in JPEG mode. So yeah, I just wanted to see if there was any sort of internal algorithm or process going on that might lead to cleaner images with high ISO. So yeah, we'll test that out and see how it performs here tonight. So I'm actually filming on another 14mm G Master. I'm gonna put that lens on this body, take side-by-side shots and just see if there is any difference in the files. Don't think there will be, but I'm just gonna kind of test things out and just kind of see if there is any bit of a difference. Can you see me? So this fully articulating screen here on the Sony a1ii Mark II is probably one of the biggest upgrades for not just astrophotographers, but for landscape photographers in general. Just having the ability to not just flip up horizontally, but if I had this camera in vertical orientation, being able to flip it out without having to like really get down to the same camera level. It's just such a nice ergonomic change that I definitely appreciate. But yeah, I only have two tripods, so I can take you off the tripod for a minute, set it up right next to, set the original a1ii right next to it, same lens, take the same shot, and yeah, we'll see what we get. Alright, now I got my double time lapse setup going. Milky Way right there. Made the mistake, I should have used the original a1ii as the horizontal and used the tilty flippy screen on the Mark II to set up the vertical time lapse, but oh well. It is what it is. One thing that I did notice right away is that when you're shooting like these extreme low light situations on the original a1ii, your display is going to give you a lot more noise readout, or like kind of the overall image when you're framing up the shot is going to look a little bit more noisy. I'll try to put some B-roll. So this is the a1ii Mark I with bright monitoring turned on. This is the a1ii Mark II with bright monitoring turned on. I guess it's not, you can't really tell too much of a difference in noise level, but I don't know, to my eyes, the a1ii Mark II is a little bit more pleasurable to look at. The other display thing too is that we can now zoom in with the bright monitoring functionality, and if you're unfamiliar with the bright monitoring functionality, that's when the LCD screen basically drops its frames per second, and then you are able to kind of brighten up the image. You can see your full composition with the trade-off that your frames per second is dropped. This is an example of bright monitoring on the a1ii Mark II. So you can see, my composition's real dark, but everything is in real time. You can see when I brighten up the scene, all the light changes and stuff that I'm doing is all in real time. Turn it off. Situation is really, really dark, but if you set the bright monitoring functionality to a custom button, in my case I set it to the down arrow, you can really brighten up your scene here. But the problem is it comes at a reduced frames per second. So if I try to move the camera, you can see there's a little bit of a delay there going on. The cool thing about the a1ii Mark II, or at least the cool thing about the a1ii Mark II when it came out, was that you can enable bright monitoring, right? And then when you zoom in with the focus, it also zooms in with it, but then because you have lost that frames per second, it's quite difficult to get like a star in focus because you don't have like that immediate feedback. So what I typically do is I flip the bright monitoring off and then zoom in and just find a bright star here, anywhere really, and then just use that, focus on the stars that way. It's just a little bit easier to get that immediate feedback. So usually I turn the bright monitoring off, grab focus, and then turn the bright monitoring on when I'm back in the wider view so that I can frame up my composition, just see a nice wide view to kind of view the composition as a whole. I don't really use the bright monitoring plus zoom functionality too much with the Mark II. And yeah, that zoom with bright monitoring functionality is not available on the A1 Mark I, the original. In terms of settings, I'm using both of these lenses shot super wide at 14 millimeters. Shutter speed of about 6 seconds. That's, according to PhotoPill, is kind of like the most optimal shutter speed just to make sure we don't get as much star trailing in the corners. So 6 seconds on the exposure time, opened up, of course, all the way to f1.8, and then ISO 6400. And ISO 6400 is usually my max ISO when shooting Milky Way or even birds or whatever. I find that with this particular sensor, if you push the ISO a little bit higher than 6400, yes, you get your image brighter, but then you start to lose a lot of detail. So I found that 6400 is kind of like the upper limit of my ISO with anything that I shoot, but especially for nighttime photography. Usually, of course, you give nice exposure to the sky, you're gonna want to get a nice foreground exposure and kind of blend those two images. That way your shot doesn't look so much like a silhouette. That's when I'll open my shutter speed up to 30 seconds and then keep the aperture wide open, but adjust focus on the foreground, and then drop the ISO to maybe something more reasonable like 2000, 3200, something like that, just to get a nice clean foreground shot. And then it's so easy to just kind of blend those two images in post. It's honestly not that hard. So yeah, it's a nice simple way to get clean Milky Way shots. Bit of a boo-boo already. I always do this. I can never do a fully accurate Milky Way side-by-side test because I always mess it up somehow. I had the shutter on the Alpha 1 Mark II as an electronic shutter, and the electronic shutter was going while the thing was time-lapsing. So I just switched it over to mechanical shutter. And I also just switched it over from compressed RAW to uncompressed RAW. I always forget to do those two things when kind of transitioning my workflow from landscape time-lapse and wildlife to Milky Way time-lapse, because obviously, Milky Way, you want to capture as much detail as possible, so you want to be shooting uncompressed. You're also going to be wanting to shoot mechanical shutter and not electronic shutter, so it's something that I always forget to do. And of course I didn't switch my Alpha 1 Mark I from compressed, because that's usually my time-lapse camera and like regular landscape time-lapse camera, so I forgot to switch it from compressed to uncompressed. But it was doing mechanical shutter though, so I remember to do that at least. But I think we gotta redo the entire test at the end just to make sure that we get everything perfect and correct towards the end. Got anything happening with this tree, boys? A little bit. Small kind of action. We were gonna shoot the Darwin tree, which is a little bit lower than the visitor center over here, but unfortunately it was all fogged out, so we were like, I guess we gotta go shoot these boring trees up here. But hopefully we can get one more night to sneak out, and then we can try and get a shot from that tree at a little bit lower elevation. Hopefully there'll be no more fog. We can do a little bit more testing there too, but in the meantime, it's just these two little trees. Whew. Milky Way in the summertime here in Hawaii, it's so difficult because yes, this Milky Way position is so it's a nice position, you know, get this nice arch, but it's so high up in the sky, so it's really hard to find like compositions. You gotta like look for like a tree and be like super low to the ground and pointing up towards the sky, whereas at higher latitudes like mainland like Utah, like Oregon, you know, you can shoot Milky Way June, July, and the core is still relatively low on the horizon. Even though it's like, you know, at a vertical angle, the core is still low. Because Hawaii is so close to the equator, that lower latitude just makes it really, really difficult to get a shot, especially when it starts to get up this high. It's like you get like the first part of the evening, like 8 to like maybe like 10:30, but by the time it starts to reach 11 o'clock, it really gets hard to frame up a good composition. But hopefully, my time lapses are gonna get something good, hopefully. Really cold tonight. Anyways, good evening, everybody. We're back out here on Mauna Kea. This time we're shooting this little tree that we found on the side of the road. Yesterday I was able to kind of show you a little bit of the UI differences between the Alpha 1 Mark II and the original Alpha 1, but I totally forgot to take side-by-side raw comparisons. So that's gonna be the main goal for tonight. We're just gonna, you know, do side-by-side raw comparisons once the Milky Way does rise up a little bit more, and then we'll be able to, you know, grab ourselves a nice Milky Way shot with both of these cameras, and then, you know, compare it side by side. And then we'll just, you know, we'll use tonight as, you know, just the raw file test, because tonight is going to be a quick Milky Way session. I don't know if we're going to do any more Milky Way on this trip, but tomorrow we're going to head up to Hakalau National Forest Reserve, try and get some of the rare birds. So we have an early start tomorrow, so we're gonna try and keep things short tonight. But yeah, nice little tree. Hopefully we'll be able to, you know, get a nice shot once the Milky Way, you know, starts to come out. But I'm gonna try to take a couple test shots and just see where the best spot to set up is. All right, we got our comps set up right next to each other. There's the tree right there. Get the Milky Way back there. Just gotta wait for these two hooligans to set up, and then I can take my test shot. The night looks clear. I just gotta wait for the core to rise just a little bit higher. Just get above the tree, and then that's gonna be the shot. We'll probably end up doing vertical time lapse with the Alpha 1 Mark. Actually, I should do horizontal with the Mark 1, vertical with the Mark 2, because it's for the tilty flippy screen. So we'll flip that. But then, yeah, should be good. Should be good. morning, everybody. As you can see, we are back here, unfortunately, on the islands of Oahu. I apologize that these recent vlogs have just been kind of all over the place. When I was on the Big Island, I'm traveling with my friends, and it's just not the most ideal situation to be filming concluding thoughts on these vlogs, so I kind of have to catch up back here on Oahu. But yeah, keep an eye out for this vlog coming up in the future. It's definitely going to be a fun one this morning, but think of this as more of a sneak preview and a concluding thoughts to our little astrophotography test that we did on the Big Island. Oh, this is a little bit too dark. Let me bring this up here. There we go. It's a little bit better. This is the Amelia Earhart Memorial. It's going to be our little bit of a backdrop for today. Got a little bit of stars in the sky here, but relatively clear. Nothing too crazy in terms of sunrise. But yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of concluding thoughts on our test between the original OG Alpha 1 Mark 1 versus the Alpha 1 Mark 2 for astrophotography. When we take a look at the files, you can definitely see that there is a difference in the amount of detail and the amount of noise in the corners of the image. The original Alpha 1 Mark 1 has a little bit more of this kind of greenish noise in the corner, which can be easily corrected if you know how to edit. And it's not that huge of a deal, especially if you are going to be taking a longer exposure or a foreground image and blending it with your shorter exposure for your Milky Way, which is typically how I like to shoot astrophotography. But yeah, when we look at the Alpha 1 Mark II, you can clearly see that there isn't that green kind of color cast in the noise in the corners. There's still a lot of noise around the edges of the frame, but it's not as green color casted as the OG Alpha 1 Mark 1, which is good. That means even though that they share the same sensor, through upgrading all the computers and the processing that's going on with the image, they did make some slight improvements to noise performance, and that you can definitely see that when it comes to astrophotography. And when it comes to astrophotography, these situations are where we're going to be pushing our camera sensors to its literal physical limit. And unlike most other genres of photography, sunrise, sunset, wildlife, you usually have a little bit of ambient light to kind of light your foreground. So the difference between the OG Alpha 1 and the Alpha 1 Mark II's image quality is not going to be that much of a difference. You are really only going to notice this difference in image quality if you are doing astrophotography and literally pushing your camera sensor to its limits. So if you are kind of deciding between the OG Alpha 1 and the Alpha 1 Mark II, and you do a little bit of astrophotography, a little bit of nighttime photography, I would definitely consider that the Alpha 1 Mark II's improvement in both the ergonomics department and the very, very slight improvement in the noise performance department justify the higher price tag to kind of upgrade to, the Alpha 1 Mark II. The OG Alpha 1 is still fine, and I'd still take that camera and that sensor over the 61 megapixel sensor from the a7R4 and the a7R5 when it comes to astrophotography, but just know that it's not going to be as polished or as good as the Alpha 1 Mark II. Now let's say you're a dedicated astrophotographer, or maybe you're a landscape photographer, and you don't really kind of need the speed and all the technology and all the functionality that the Alpha 1 Mark II provides. I would definitely take a look at the A7 IV with its 33 megapixel sensor. Is actually a really nice sensor for astrophotography. When I used that camera, I definitely enjoyed using it as a dedicated time-lapse camera and B camera. I didn't notice that the noise level and the image quality was at all an issue. And even the late and great Alan Wallace, the astrophotographer that everybody associates with astrophotography, Alan Wallace actually shot with a couple of A7 IVs as kind of his main camera for astrophotography. So take that into consideration if you are going to be a dedicated astrophotographer and you're looking for, I guess, the optimal balance between resolution and image quality and noise performance. The A7 IV is probably the way to go. But yeah, as somebody who shoots in a more ADHD type of style, we do a lot of wildlife, a landscape, astrophotography, kind of jump between genres of photography, I definitely think that the Alpha 1 Mark II's improvements in both ergonomics, wildlife photography technology with the pre-capture and the autofocus and the animal eye autofocus in video, as well as the noise performance in extreme low light conditions, just make it the perfect choice, and it just kind of reaffirms my purchase, I guess. And hopefully you guys found this helpful if you are deciding between getting the OG Alpha 1 because it is discounted and cheaper and on sale, and the Alpha 1 Mark II, and maybe you can justify living with that just decrease in image quality and green noise performance. But yeah, just putting this information out there to you guys. Somebody might care about it, somebody who's deciding between these two flagship cameras. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this type of content, this travel, vacation, a little bit of photography education, hit that like button, comment below, subscribe if you aren't already. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.